Welcome to this special discussion at ORF's Colaba conversation. A common theme among each of the industrial revolutions that we've seen so far is, at least as definitions might go, the invention of a specific technology that has changed our lives fundamentally. As the terminology goes for the fourth IR or the fourth industrial revolution, the belief is that it sort of signaled the arrival of extraordinary technology that's perhaps in some senses merged both the physical, the digital, and the biological worlds that we all live in at this point. It has certainly changed how we work. It has also changed who works, and it has changed how businesses and governments are run and will be run going henceforth, especially with what's gone through in 2020 and the pandemic year. But what at this point are the key challenges and opportunities as we step into what is still not a normal life or a new normal, if you'd like to call it that? And how does one prepare oneself, both as a nation, as a community, and as an individual, to take on this construct of a fourth IR or a fourth industrial revolution? We've got some great faces to talk about that and perhaps even debate the idea of whether or not this is indeed the fourth industrial revolution. So let me, without further ado, introduce my panel to our viewers. Professor Kate Clonick, who's Assistant Professor at Law at St. John's University Law School. Ms. Terry Chapman, who's Visiting Fellow at ORF, and she's an Urban Analyst with the World Bank, Washington, D.C. And Mr. Ram Sidis, who's Deputy CEO of the Federation of Local Authorities in Israel. He's also in charge of innovation. So they're all weighing in with a lot of perspective over here. First up, welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking the time out to have this chat. I thought I might open with asking you to sort of set the context of how you see this conversation on a fourth IR. Give me your opening comments and then we'll take it from there. So Terry, might I start with you?
Yes, sure. Great. Thank you, Mitali, and thank you to my colleagues at ORF. You've done an excellent job organizing this event, as always, so thank you. So my name is Terry. As Mitali said, I'm a visiting fellow at ORF. And over the last couple of years, I've been investigating the future of work and focusing primarily on the adoption of technologies and the impacts of that on jobs and skills with a focus on India. But I've also looked at sort of the fourth IR in a little bit more of a broad sense. So I would say that, the fourth IR, we could say, is really reshaping many different aspects of our lives, sometimes without us even knowing that that's the case. And, that's true from the adoption of artificial intelligence in things like our criminal justice system, in human resource management, in sectors like healthcare, retail. So across the board, the fourth industrial revolution is transforming sort of many different aspects of life. And so I think, one of the key arguments and key messages that I would like to get across today is that, we need to sort of recognize as a society that the fourth IR, all of the impacts of the fourth IR are not inevitable. And we as a society sort of have to decide how we want to shape our future, how we want technologies to be adopted, and sort of take responsibility for that, both as a society, but also as individuals. So think critically about how we want to engage with different technologies. So I'll just leave it there for a second and let the others sort of introduce themselves.
Kate, over to you.
Yeah, I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to be take a little bit of a contrarian position. I come from a world of law and policy and technology. And so both parts of how we define industrial revolution and what Terry just said, which was so brilliant about kind of this idea of it changing how we work and how we live. I would say that this is broader than just industry, and this is broader than a revolution. There is a there's a story that I use when I'm teaching internet law that is by David Foster Wallace that starts off going like there are two young fish swimming in the ocean, and they come upon an old grandfather fish, and the old grandfather fish says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And he swims on, and the one fish turns to the other fish and says, "What's water?" And I think that kind of to a large extent, what we're seeing in everything that the internet and technology is giving us in this moment is collectively, it might have happened for you during COVID, it might have happened in the 5 years preceding COVID, it might have happened in the 10 years before that, or the 20 years before that. But at some point you're waking up and realizing, oh, that there's like this entire kind of world that's held together by something, by water, and like we just took it completely for granted. And by eliminating so many frictions in work and life and communication, in politics, in an amplification of speech, the internet is erasing those frictions and revealing new weaknesses in a lot of how we built, and a lot of the systems that we've built based on those frictions being in place, based on it being difficult to talk to someone in Hyderabad, like when you're sitting in like Boston, Massachusetts, or something like that. So like the fact that all of those things are easier now, the fact that that changes everything is, I guess, what I kind of wanted to focus on today, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Ram, where do you weigh in on the fourth IR debate?
Well, first of all, thank you and shalom from Tel Aviv to all the participants in the panel. I think that I'll give some sort of special examples into the four revolution. First of all, on the role of the municipalities on this section. The impact of COVID-19, of what we call the fourth revolution, and what the COVID have done, let's take it to the bad sides and the good sides. And maybe the last thing, but not least, it's the role of crisis on innovation, a crisis that we have been, let's say, struggled here in our house, in our home, but as a global pandemic and crisis in the area of technology and society, economic, and etc.
Excellent. Thank you for all of that. Terry, let me pick up on a point that Kate made specifically with COVID itself. Recently, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said, we've seen 2 years' worth of digital transformation happen literally in the span of a couple of months. In that sense, do you think the sort of the sharp mark for the fourth IR and what it's changed has been the pandemic here, or do you believe that it's just a continuation of an upward sloping curve?
No, I think that there has been. I do think that like maybe if you wanted to kind of narrow the scope, that this has certainly been, and I'm going to expand this. It's not just about how people work, which I would say like it kind of sounds like the labor aspect of this is a huge part of the definition. But it's really how people communicate with each other, their ability to kind of be aware of the power that their government and the power that private actors and tech companies have over them, and that pharmaceutical companies have over them and their daily lives. And I think that the last year has certainly been kind of at least it has forced everyone who is slowly marching in this direction to really confront the realities. Just in the last 10 months of how the norms that have developed about talking over Zoom and other type of digital technologies is kind of amazing. And watching like some of my older colleagues, my parents, understand that you mute yourself, that you get headphones, that there's all of these kind of really basic kind of norms that kind of take place. And that's a forcing function that that COVID has absolutely happened. All of those people might never have kind of have come into this moment and into this revolution, as you call it. I just say that like industrial revolution. I just think it's interesting because everyone comes from a different discipline in this conversation, and IR is not how we have like my world has spends a lot of time talking about this. And so I just kind of, so that for me, I'm just like pointing out that distinction too, that's super interesting, is that has not been how any of my colleagues are talking about this. It's more like disruptive technology or something else. And so I just kind of think that that's just an interesting labeling difference across different types of areas.
Today, I want to talk a little bit more about what this means at a company level, though, because that's been the big takeaway, not just of what we saw through in 2020, but the fourth IR, which is that not everyone needs to be a data scientist, but everyone needs to be, as Kate pointed out, data literate. At this point, what is your sense of whether organizations generally have the talent and the resources to actually master working in that paradigm, or do you think that is happening? Or do you believe that companies are sorely lacking in that regard, and that's something they need to build going forward?
Yeah, so I mean, I think to your previous question, I think COVID has really accelerated some of the trends that we already saw. So working, remotely, for example, is something that we've seen, emerging previously. But I think importantly, the coronavirus has also sort of cemented some inequalities that we've seen emerging out of the sort of adoption of 4IR technologies, but also just more generally. So, for instance, if you think about the emergence of the gig economy, right? The populations like people of color, women, low-income workers, immigrants, they're disproportionately represented, right, in the gig economy. And I would say also that in the coronavirus, it's been the same populations, more or less, that have been disproportionately impacted. So a lot of people of color, a lot of women, have either are working in jobs that are more risky. They're, bearing the burden of additional tasks like childcare. So I would say that, we have seen both an acceleration of things that we already were experiencing. And one of the main challenges, I would say, is this sort of cementing of inequalities that were already sort of posing a challenge, not directly driven by technologies of the fourth IR, but in some ways sort of also pushed forward by the adoption of those technologies.
So let me rephrase the previous question, Kerry, and ask you that. I mean, aside from companies being data literate, would you say that companies are aware of the fact that these shifts have taken place, or aware of the fact that these gaps, these chasms have opened up? And do you think enough is being done at this point to address the problem? I mean, I take your point about a gig economy, but even so, for companies to be responsible for the workforce that they employ, are they being mindful of these large inequalities?
I think companies are, to some extent, mindful and aware of these inequalities, but I would say that not enough is being done on the part of companies or governments in sort of regulating and protecting workers. So we see that, as I said, with the gig economy, that workers that are in the gig economy, or just more broadly, non-standard employees, so those that are working part-time, temporary jobs, they don't have the same kind of protections that people in the traditional workforce would have. And again, those are typically workers who have been excluded from full-time jobs. So you have already sort of disadvantaged populations who are in those positions. So I would say that companies might be aware of some of those risks. Gig economy for workers, for examples, are much more at risk of injury and death at work than other positions. And I think that's even more so the case now in the middle of a pandemic, when a lot of service workers are out delivering packages to people and providing essential services. So I would say that yes, there's awareness, but definitely not enough is being done on the part of companies to protect workers and the government in ensuring that protections are there for workers and regulating that.
That's a great point, and I do want to come into that in more detail, especially in terms of the impact on youth. But Ram, let me throw you in here and talk about this from a government level perspective, because that's the other criticism: the fact that governments or policymakers they don't have data innovation or technology in their toolkit. Has that changed, or do you think that's something governments really need to sort of lock down and double down on now, trying to build some kind of a data toolkit for themselves and for people who are part of policy making?
As I said earlier, I think the good impact of the COVID and all the things that we are now facing is the changing, and the change eventually came to the field of the governments and municipalities. And if I can take a quick look from our perspective and our prisma, I can say that the way people are actually doing their work is changing. Even here in Israel, it's not just the technology and the innovation, the actual workplace is changing. We don't know how much of this will return to normal, if I say, whatever that means. For example, companies with office big and small don't need the offices right now, but everyone is telecommunicating, and that change everything, including in our place. Will people go back to the physical offices? I think that yes, but the Federation of Local Authority, for example, we have already taken a decision that the employees can work from home at least one day a week. And I think that will be something that we will keep on doing it after the COVID. Will they get their work done? Probably can. Will they be less stressed? I think yes, but time will tell if it works if it works good. And finally, I can say that there's no way going back. I think that we will find our, let's say, mutual points, and eventually we find a different place where what we've been 10 months ago or 1 year ago, even in the municipality levels, not only in the tech fields.
Would you say, though, Ram, that it's been extremely differentiated in terms of its reach and impact? I mean, just to give, a country like India, for example, it's actually a slim majority, a slim minority of people who did have access to work from home setups, whether it's internet access or whether they actually have the physical space to work from home. And in that sense, both COVID and this fourth IR has created far greater economic differences compared to what existed earlier in an already extremely unequal world. Is this reaching out to people differently when you look at it from your lens?
Yes, although we're only 9 million people here in Israel and it's a small country, we can see the differences inside our country. We can see areas that are rural or let's say sectoral that don't have the access to the internet or let's say other technology fields, and it's bringing the gap, it's increasing the gap. And one of our main job is to take those problems and deal with them. It's obvious that Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Herzliya, so those kind of cities will can do it better and can do it without us. But we have to take the small ones, the peripheral ones, and get them on board and to embrace them and bring them to the field where everyone else is over there. So even in our small country, even in our tech country, there are big differences and a lot of gap, and we must build the bridge between those gaps and narrow them.
Here, I want to pick up specifically on the youth as a pocket in terms of the socioeconomic inequity or the widening wealth gap. Intuitively, one feels that the youth is drawn greater to data and technology, and it comes easier to them. But if you just looked at the data in terms of the impact, I mean, in the G7, more than 6 million people lost their jobs at the peak. In the US, unemployment rates are extremely high. Here in India, numbers from December stand at a very high 9%. And a lot of the job losses that happened were actually in sectors that are highly represented by the youth, the services space, travel, tourism, hospitality. Do you see that getting corrected, or do you think these are jobs that have now been lost for good? And that's something the fourth IR will have to recalibrate. The fact that we have greater technology and greater access, but far greater inequality and far greater access even to work opportunities.
Well, I say it in brief. There are some fields that we don't need to be there. The changing of, let's say, works that eventually happens in the last century is much more quicker than in the last one. Things are getting much more faster. Fields like work in tech or in, let's say, things that were connected to the pandemic goes very good without municipalities or government interfere. We just need to let that happen, lose bureaucracy, let them alone, let them run, and we will, let's say, stay at beside them, let them work. We don't need to be there. Our main issue is really to release regulation, let them go much more faster. We believe in the economic fields. We believe that market is doing what he needs to do, and we don't need to interrupt.
Kate, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually almost never hear such a robust defense from my end of things of the market totally fixing this. I'm usually on panels with people urging and dying for there to be more regulatory control over how technologies are distributed and these kind of things because of because it is so disruptive right now, and it's making a lot of it's kind of the people who didn't have before, the fact that they don't have now, like internet access, basic access to computers, is sharper than ever. I mean, I think that I'm going to just point out something really interesting about Rob's point that I agree with completely, which is kind of just that this has been an industry driven. This has been an industry driven movement. This is something that has come out directly from new technologies that have been created by private industry, not created by municipal power. Like the municipal and government powers have laid the last in a lot of places. If you're lucky, the last kind of, as we put it, mile of pipe of like conduit to like basically having access to the internet, the pipe that runs into your house and gives you that like that internet that like it doesn't make sense for private industry to do. But the most of this has really come from initiatives and technology that's all been controlled by the private sector. What I think is fascinating about that is that it's ubiquity now, it's necessity now, it's absolute unparalleled kind of way that it has changed how we're looking at all of these questions today, is that it's a private company, and it's very scary to leave that. It's run by private companies, and it's very threatening to leave that entirely to market forces, lest the people that are the farthest behind continue getting left the furthest behind, and you don't ever get to the point where there's that people have access to internet becomes harder to better your life and to dig yourself out. Now, one of the things about leaving it to the market is that there's periods, any economist will tell you, is there periods of like it's going to be uncomfortable for a while. People are going to be cast off and have to reinvent themselves and develop new skills. And then jobs are going to have to be created to fit those skills. And you're going to have periods in which that's difficult. I completely agree with that. I do think that we're having kind of that period right now. I just think that there are ways that, one, we can try to ease the fall and like kind of make it so that at the very base level that there's a baseline of internet access that everyone has access to, so that it's easier to find a gig economy job. It's easier to find some new job. It's easier to get educated and reinvent yourself and take advantage of the things that the market is creating. And then I think we have to rethink how we think of private industry and how it's controlling public rights and like freedom of expression, and trying to kind of build some kind of participatory democracy or some type of like of public accountability into these private companies that are controlling public rights, because I just think that that's like that's a piece of all of this that we've really never seen transnational companies control like human rights before in quite this way.
Terry, come in on that. I mean, how do we make this process more human-centric, but equally, how are we mindful of, the developing versus developed world context in this? In fact, I'll give you an example, and it's not even developing versus developed. If you look at education, for example, just having access to internet has created such wide gaps in terms of education, not just in developing countries like India, but even in the UK, there's a big fall in terms of academic performance because there's kids who simply did not have access to the internet to learn. How do we become more mindful about becoming human-centric about this, rather than the big arches of what big data can deliver, what AI can deliver?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important question. To the education thing, I mean, I think, it's clear that kids who didn't have access to internet and devices, whether that's in India or other developing countries or in the United States, have fallen behind in the last year, right? Because they haven't had the essential good of access to the internet. And as Kate was saying, that really is, access to the internet really is becoming a public good. Having that is essential for working and for education right now. And I think, even after the pandemic, that will continue to be true. And it really is inequality increasing that the private sector has control over that. So, I'm from Vermont originally, which is a rather rural state. And I can say that, there's hardly any internet access there. And so the cost is extremely high for, getting that last mile connectivity. And so many people just can't afford to do that. And so I think, we have to reframe access to the internet and devices as sort of a public good and ensure that those last mile connections happen, because otherwise we will see, continued increase in inequality between those who have access and those that don't. So I think that's a critical issue. And to the other point, about easing the fall for workers, I think that's just absolutely essential now in the context of the pandemic, but also just in general. I mean, the United States, for instance, has such a kind of pathetic system of social protections that is just not sufficient for meeting the needs of people in regular times, in difficult times, people in the gig economy. And I think that's, critical for meeting the needs of workers in an increasingly sort of fragile labor market. So I think, investing majorly in those social safety nets, social protections is obviously super important. And yeah, so I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you have. I wanted to ask you also whether you think we now need to develop a different economic construct in order to do this, Terry, because, just to pick up on the point you're making about people falling out from the job force or the workforce, there is the longer term impact of scarring, the knock-on effect of people who have lost their jobs and the long-term impact on their income levels. Do you think governments across the world now need to sort of budget differently for this? To create that pipeline that Kate was talking about, where access to water and electricity must come with access to the internet, as also to provide some kind of social security net, as you pointed out. Do we need to create different economic models now to support this fourth IR?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily economic models, but the way that I think about it is really sort of social policies, right? So we need to rethink our social policy structure. So if we think about, the employer-employee relationship, right? So typically our social protection systems are defined by this relationship of a full-time worker who works for a company, and that company is responsible for meeting certain basic benefits, right? But now we have so many people. So this is increasing, across the industrialized world, across developing countries, an increase in people who are in non-standard forms of work. So that means temporary jobs, part-time jobs, and that means that the turnover of work is much more frequent. So you have many more gaps in your career than we might have had a few decades ago. And so what that means is that the employer-employee relationship, so individuals getting basic social protections like healthcare, unemployment insurance, all of those things through an employer just doesn't make sense anymore. So I think the essential thing is to sort of rethink how we provide basic social protections. The most obvious thing to me is that we need to de-link it from employment and ensure that there's universal basic access to social protections. And so in times of crisis like now, people aren't falling below the poverty line because they don't have any income. And I think that's sort of the key thing that we need, whether it's in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, whether it's in the context of the pandemic, or just generally.
Could I just
please come in on that, Kate.
I just wanted to quickly piggyback on what Terry said, which I thought was brilliant, and I completely agree with, which is the decoupling of health benefits and other types of basic care that we don't have because we don't have a UBI in the United States that need to be decoupled. I want to give one other reason that should happen, which is because we just talked about the power that these private companies have over us as individuals and as end users, giving them more power over us as employees because we depend on them to provide health insurance for ourselves and our family, gives us one less thing in our toolkit to be able to push back on policy decisions and really important things that these private companies control that right now, we're seeing the only really good kind of, and I'm not saying it's a good way to actually protest or change policy. I think it's dramatically inefficient, but is employee protest, boycott, and walkout. And so those things become very difficult, or you're not going to do them at all when you would lose all of your health insurance and your entire family's health insurance with your employer. So just wonderful point, Terry. Just wanted to +1 that.
Ram, I know you navigated your own little bump over there with the internet and the fourth IR, so I'm glad to have you back with the light and everything. Comment on this important point that's made about health, because this is a big one. It's a space where technology stood up and made its place through this entire COVID pandemic. I mean, AI helped you trace data, big data helped you spot trends and figure out isolation cases, the spread. Cloud computing has created a backbone for countries that want to put in a health system. How do you manage health, which has clearly emerged as a priority from 2020, and marry it with technology and fourth IR and make sure that henceforth it works where it's supposed to? Because ironically, the spaces that collapsed the fastest were the urban pockets that one would argue has greatest access to technology, but it didn't help when it came to healthcare.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry about the technology
Sorry
problem.
about
It's okay. I hope that I've heard you good. First of all, I must emphasize that in Israel, we have already vaccinated more than 2 million people, almost 25% of the population. It's, I think, of all the bureaucratics and municipalities problem, that's sometimes some like of a light for the way. So that's something that will get us on track very soon, and maybe will be the first country that will get out of this COVID-19. I think that the municipal parts of the technology, as I said, is not to be and interfere, but as we all mentioned, there's a big gap. We've just heard about the education in the US, and I must say that some technologies problem and some technologies issues that we deal with, let's say, give an example. We took the TV channels and remote them from TV to school, let's say, school education. We took infrastructure that we needed them for something like radio, television, and we changed them for school from far behind. So we have to think outside the box. We have to try to change things that we have done them before, and think about a new way to deal with our problems. And the basis of all the things, it's the innovation, it's the thinking outside the box. It's the connection between people. Where with lack of sitting around the table and think together, in our 10 months, we're sitting everyone is sitting by themselves, thinking, maybe speaking by the Zoom, but it can't replace meeting people. It can't replace speaking and thinking together, because it's the basic of all innovation. It's the basic of solving problems. And that is one of the things that we must go back and redoing it. And I think that it will be the key of our solving the next problem that we'll be facing soon.
Okay, I know we're running a bit short on time, but I'm conscious of getting closing comments from you because I'm keen to hear more about this. Kate, the thing about this revolution, if we want to call it that, is also that it's not an uncontrollable force of nature. I mean, there are end users and end consumers, and there are large companies, like you pointed out. What would you say are the 2 or 3 things that end consumers must now demand in order to make sure that there is a more equitable spread of this fourth IR that we talk about, or even the sharing of technology? What's your sort of 2 or 3 things that people should take away from this?
Yeah, I mean, one of them is to try to, as I think we've talked about, I think I'll just reemphasize that the getting people connected and getting them connected in ways that are not zero rated. And not run by private companies, getting that last mile of pipe, making it content neutral and getting it to everyone so that we have a basic building block, so that, as Ram said, that you can inspire, like you can connect people, like you could have brilliant people all over the world that don't have jobs, but if you can't connect them and you can't get them in front of people to share their ideas, it's completely useless. And so having at least that very basic access to internet, and the internet as a public good, I think is a huge part of something that we need to put an emphasis on, and hopefully that will be the job of governments. And the other thing that this is like my talking point pretty much generally, is that after studying these large technology companies, it's really to try to change your mindset around what governance means, what democracy means. There are 2 ways to try to create more democratically accountable private companies that are controlling your public rights. One is to go and try to ask government to regulate them and to do it for you. I think that that's a little ham-fisted, and will end up with us having, killing a lot of great technology and potentially kind of not letting market forces and the technology do its work. That being said, something clearly needs to be done because, and by the way, I should also mention that I don't think that these companies I think these companies are so large right now that they are not controllable or will not take heel or cannot be like tamed by any one nation necessarily. I think they're, they are transnational companies that exist within and between every country in the world. And so what I really think is the best solution is to try to start thinking of private companies in new ways and building public accountability mechanisms into them, and maybe regulating. That is the way, the future of regulation to happen, is to demand accountability measures and demand some type of accountability specifically around policy that is being made as it pertains to public information, to freedom of expression, to public health, things like that. And so that's really where if I'm talking where I think the conversation is going to be, what I thought the conversation was going to be 5 years ago and have been pushing for it, and I feel like we're finally here. That's where I'm hoping the conversation goes in the next 10 years, is to explode our minds, at least in the US, from talking about we fix this through regulation and law, and start thinking bigger and thinking about other ways in which we can try to get these companies to be accountable to end users and global citizens that they connect.
Sure. Terry, same question to you. How do we ensure more potential and less peril?
Yeah, I think Kate's point is really interesting, and I do think that addressing the power of large tech companies right now is essential, especially for protecting our democratic institutions and our democracy in general. And I do agree with what Kate said, and that we really do need to take a transnational approach, because regulating them within the United States doesn't address many of the international issues. So I completely agree with what she said.
Ram, final word with you. What would you set out as, and what an individual should sort of take away from this?
I take it to a positive way. Once in a year, we're trying to close the gap between the technology and the municipalities level. And we are taking municipally Muni World Expo, that it's a conference, almost 10,000 people are coming there, more than 200 companies are in the exhibition. And we're trying to, let's say, as I said, close the gap between the technology and the people. And that is our role as a municipality, trying to view them, all the great things that can be there. And as Terry said, take it step by step. The democratic is very fragile. We need to see what we are doing. And we have a role in the municipalities to keep an eye on it and try to stand it on the good level. And as I said before, sharing knowledge and best practices between us, like in this event, is important for all of us. And I hope that in June 2021, you can all come physically, if not maybe virtual in a platform, and share each other with our success or try to event failures.
Thank you for the invite, and thank you all of you for your time. You're so right. I think in 2016, when this term was coined, Schwab also pointed out that the greatest societal concern would be inequality, and that's really come to the fore in this pandemic year. I really appreciate your time and thoughts. To all my guests, thank you very much for watching. To our viewers as well, goodbye for now.